Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Rising Laterally podcast. This is Arjun Sachdev.
And this is Jay Ballou. We hope you find something here that offers you new meaning or a fresh perspective.
If you do, we encourage you to give it life.
Be bold.
Experiment.
And most importantly, bring it into the interactions with the people you surround yourself with.
And see what happens. How do you measure progress, and what shape does it take? While it is true that of the Fortune 500 companies today, 38 have women CEOs, it is also true that in the United States in 2020, the gender wage gap stood at women earning 81 cents for every dollar a man was paid. In most places around the world, men earn more than women. Not all, but most. And in countries where women are working, which is an indication by society of progress, they sometimes are working much longer hours than men. Take Benin and Tanzania, two African countries, for example, where women work 17 and 14 more hours than men per week, respectively. You may find out that women are graduating from colleges and universities at higher rates than men are, while also learning that women make up 2/3 of the world's almost 800 million illiterate people. It might shock you to know that roughly 70% of the estimated 40 million modern-day slaves are women, or that according to a UN report from 2018, globally, 137 women are killed by a member of their family every day. To help us better understand where there is equality, where there is inequality, where we are on the gender equality progress chart, and where we can take actions next, we are joined today by a changemaker. Maureen Devine-Ahl is the author of the book called To Make the Matriarchy: The Power and Promise of Prioritizing Women. She spent 2 decades in the nonprofit, social, and public service sectors, and she is the principal and founder of Candor Company, where she helps impact the lives of current and rising female leaders who are navigating growth and inclusion challenges. We asked her to share her perspective on a subject that impacts every level of society, and to share what she's learned being a passionate diversity facilitator, leadership coach, speaker, author, and women's empowerment advocate. Maureen, welcome to the Rising Laterally podcast.
Thank you. I've got little goosebumps from that intro because you hit on so many of the amazing, interesting, fascinating, and depressing, all of the above global statistics that I'm so excited to spend some time with you guys exploring today.
Yeah, we're excited as well.
Absolutely. And your book, it's full of facts and it's full of information. I didn't know, as it relates to the different structures and systems that are in place. And, it creates all types of inequality. Yes, we're talking about gender inequality, but it obviously talks about wage inequality as well. And I know that we're going to talk about that, but you definitely provided a specific lens. You tried to show that when women's empowerment is prioritized, there's a strong case to be made that many parts of society benefit. But before we get too deep into your book, your research, and how you're trying to make change, Jay and I are both interested in learning a little bit about you. So why don't you tell us where you grew up, what life was like there at that time, and a few of the key pit stops along the way that led you on your journey to this point?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in upstate New York in a tiny little town called Amsterdam, New York. It's just outside of the Albany region in upstate New York. And honestly, it's a town that is mostly surrounded by farms. It was a town that boomed, in the industrial age. It was a carpet mill town. So right on the river, we have a ton of carpet mills. But when I was growing up there, obviously, the carpet mill industry was moving on or moving overseas or wherever it went. So the town was definitely struggling, but we had a strong middle class in our town, and that's really the kind of family that I grew up in. My mom was a teacher, and my dad had a plumbing business, and we did just fine there. And so, through that lens growing up, it seemed like my childhood was normal and idyllic for, what I knew of the world. But it was after I moved out of upstate New York, I still went to college in upstate New York. So I still had a pretty similar experience there. But it was after, I left college, I moved to the Washington, D.C. area and had my first work in the nonprofit sector down here. And then we lived in a few different places while my husband was active duty Air Force. that, the lens starts to get a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger, a little
Yeah.
bigger.
Yeah.
And so now I've lived in the Washington, D.C. area collectively for 10 plus years. So super diverse here, a place obviously where people love to talk politics, where people love to talk policy. So I've gotten exposed to a lot more things. But it wasn't until a couple of years ago, really, what set me on this particular journey. I've always had an interest in nonprofits, in the social sector, in helping people. I really believe that we rise individually by lifting others, and that's something that I've always carried through my work. But it was a couple of years ago. So I have a daughter, she's about to be 10. But when she was in second grade, she came home with a class project where they were supposed to do a wax museum. So the idea was everybody picks a historical figure, and then they're going to come in on a Friday. They're going to dress like this figure and, have a note card with some facts. And parents could come visit the quote unquote wax museum and learn about these historical figures. So the list she came home of choices of historical figures was 10 names long. And it took me a minute to realize it, but she had circled 3 names on the list. She had circled Rosa Parks, Helen Keller, and Jackie Robinson. And I was like, those are 3 interesting choices. What's going on here? And
Yeah.
I realized she had circled those names because she knew 2 of them were women, and presumed Jackie Robinson was also a woman. And I went, oh, she's trying to get to the women on the list. Oh, wait, there's only 2 women on this list to choose from.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I reached out to school and was like, hey, just noticed this. Do you think we could expand the list or check the list out the window? And I checked in with some of the other moms in my neighborhood, and I was like, did you guys see this? And they were like, yeah, we saw it. And I was just blown away when the principal emailed me back and said, yeah, we noticed that too, but it's in the curriculum for the state of Virginia. So we're following the curriculum. And I went like, what now?
Right.
So I, of course, had to look it up for myself. And there it was in the state of Virginia history curriculum, second grade. Here's the list of 10 historical figures that are required to be taught. And that made me go, well, this is just second grade. What does the whole K through 12 experience look like? So, and this journey is really symbolic, I think, of the book writing journey. It was like find a little rabbit hole and then like keep scratching, keep scratching, keep scratching till you get to the bottom of it. So I ended up hiring somebody on Fiverr to help me read the entire K through 12 history curriculum.
Whoa.
And count the number of times names were mentioned specifically to be read, and then figure out how many of those were male historical figures versus female. We counted a couple of different ways. George Washington appears like every year, 3 times a year, practically.
Yeah.
So when we finally, took out duplicates, took out like Martin Luther King Jr. Day when it's in like the holiday curriculum or whatever, we came down to about 10%. So 10% of the names in all of K through 12 that are required in historical curriculum are women. The rest, 90%, it's all male historical figures. And that blew my mind because I was like, hold the phone. I thought by now my daughter was getting a quality, equal education. Boys and girls have equal access, equal opportunities, right? Great.
Right.
And that was a moment that I went, she might have equal access and maybe equal opportunities, but the quality and content of what she's learning still hasn't caught up. And I was totally missing it as a parent. And that made me ask myself, what else am I missing? What else needs to be worked on in my lifetime to close these gaps that are like right under our noses, but without doing some of this digging or having a moment like this, we're missing, we're not experiencing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And imagine the, parents that don't even take that much interest in seeing what the homework is that their child is doing. And, the number of years that must have been taking place. I mean, that clearly would have an impact on some of the early bias that develops against girls and even against boys in some cases. And you never know the impact that it has on these children. And that's a fascinating story. I know you mentioned the word equal a couple of times when describing that story. Let's actually take a step back, because if we want to create a more complete rally, we should clarify some of the basics. So when it comes to definitions, I think that's a good way to segue deeper into your book. Walk us how you would define words like equality or equity or matriarchy or patriarchy. Walk us through some of those definitions so we can actually have a level playing field.
Yeah. So actually, I brought the book and I have it here in my lap because I do think it's important, not to get too far out ahead of ourselves in individualizing our definitions. So that was really why. So it's like chapter 1 here, which you guys read, where I say, like, let's limber up with the lingo. And I actually go through and list Merriam-Webster's definitions. And, then I get to a spot where I say, for those of you questioning the caliber of an author who starts by copying and pasting from the dictionary, stick with me. Because, I did have a moment where it was like, okay, chapter 1, copying and pasting from the dictionary, way to kick things off, lady. But I do think it's really important because, part of this is that the reason that I think sometimes we struggle with these meanings is because if we all individualize our definitions, it means something different to each of us. So just quickly, Merriam-Webster, we can start with equality, says the quality or state of being equal. Pretty simple. Equity, on the other hand, is justice according to natural law or right, or something that is equitable. Now, in practice, equality can mean, I get 4 cookies, you get 4 cookies. But equity can mean, I haven't eaten all day, so I really deserved, 8 cookies. And that's kind of a horrible example, but it is, back to my daughter's school is the better example. So equality, she has the equal chance to go to that school, just like everybody else who is within range of that particular public school. Boys, girls, different abilities, no matter what, they all have equal access. But equity comes in with, then the quality of the experience or the quality of the opportunities. And that's where bias starts to sneak in. That's where, teachers, so I offer some data in the book where they find that, teachers start grading boys and girls differently in subjects like math and science. They just look through a different lens where, boys come out favorably in what the studies have found. So that's where equity comes into play. That my daughter's going to have that opportunity to show up every day for every grade, just like every other child her age in our neighborhood. But the quality of the experience and opportunities that she's receiving is different. So that's really equality and equity. And then we can jump into matriarchy and patriarchy if you want to go there too.
Yeah, let's
Okay.
set the foundation here.
Yeah, so this one was interesting, and we can talk a little bit too about how I got to how to make the matriarchy. It wasn't because I looked up matriarchies first and said, yes, let's do that. It was actually a moment where I was having lunch with a girlfriend of mine, and we were griping over some work things, and she kind of smashed her fist on the table and goes, right, smash the patriarchy, right? And I was like, I don't know. I just can never find myself in that rage. I said, why can't we just make the matriarchy or something? And
Oh,
she
it clicked.
she leaned in across the table and she goes, yes, I want to do that. What's that? And how do we do it? And so, it was kind of an off the cuff alliteration moment, but then I really did turn to the definitions and then spending some time exploring, are there existing matriarchies in the world and what can we learn from them? So Merriam-Webster says a matriarchy is a family, group, or state governed by a matriarch. Pretty simple. Whereas a patriarchy is social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family, the legal dependence of wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line. So that was another thing I talked about in the book, how complex and clear the definition of patriarchy is about power, supremacy, dependence. Those are all words that are in there. Whereas in matriarchy, it's a family or group or state governed by a matriarch.
Right.
And that's eventually what I go on to pull it out to, is that I found a scholar who studies matriarchy, and she really did say that these words are about power. They're about systems of power. They're not really about gender. And patriarchy is a system that is about power over others, whereas matriarchy is a system that's about the power of inclusion. And so that's really the spirit that I carried through the book is, we're making a matriarchy. If I'm going to say, let's make the matriarchy, it's about the power of inclusion. So let's explore what happens when women are more fully included, and what are those barriers that are preventing that remain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and power is a really interesting word. It's been something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. Like, how do you think about power? Because there's so many different ways to exercise it, and there's so many different manifestations of it. I feel like that's such a linchpin in the definition of patriarchy. So, when you conceptualize power, what do you think of that being, Maureen?
Yeah, I mean, because I've been so steeped in this work in this book, it is a little bit of a almost like a trigger word now, that power is power over others. But I've also been thinking a lot about, how power bleeds into other words and other spaces. So I just spoke with somebody last week who does a podcast on imposter syndrome. And talking about the concept of imposter syndrome and whether or not, like, do you really suffer it? Have you managed it? And I read something recently that was like, imposter syndrome, the fact that we have this name and this phenomenon that, we tell people they experience, is another like power play, making you believe that like you have this imposter syndrome, you don't believe in the room. It's your syndrome. It's your problem to overcome. It's your problem to fix. Still puts power on the individual. This is my individual problem to correct, and ignores that like imposter syndrome can be bred by the systems around us that say you don't belong in this room. You don't look like everybody else that's here. You don't have the experience of everyone else that is here. So I think power is a really interesting word. And I think it's one that if we spend more time thinking about it, we start to see all the places it shows up. In which it influences our lives and dictates our lives to a certain respect. And I would love for folks to start rethinking our relationship with power, personally, in our organizations, in our schools, in our relationships at home, pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, the other word that comes to mind when I think about power is control. And I think that, when you think about what happened in 2020, the whole world was affected by the pandemic, obviously. I have found a lot of people realized how much is out of their control and how much more people are trying to let go of things. And so I think if you're trying to let go of things and you feel like, hey, I'm actually not in that much control, then maybe you can start to think about yourself also not having that much power over somebody else as well. And so that might be a way to kind of limit your thinking around how much power you have over somebody and how much power somebody has over you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, I mentioned that too, that working on this book for the majority of 2020, I started it pre-pandemic, but it was a gift. It was a gift to be focusing on this at a time when the world did crack open in so many ways, in so many places where we had just been scooting through our everyday lives, hustling.
Yeah.
And we got this great pause to think about things like that, to think about our relationships with power and control and priority. And I think also, lay bare really a lot of the systems of inequality and inequity, and how this system of power over others is failing all of us in so many ways. Again, it is a book about gender, but at the same time, it's not a book about gender. It's not a book about starting a gender war by any stretch of the imagination. It's a book about going, hey, we are all suffering from these systems of power. The systems of power are working for none of us. They haven't been for a long time. So it's time to, forget what we think we know and really explore something new.
Yeah, going back to definitions, you supply us with the kind of boilerplate definition of matriarchy, and you do elaborate on it with your own thinking throughout the book. Could you tell us a little bit about the matriarchy that you conceptualized in terms of the matriarchy that was in the title of the book? Like, what type of matriarchy or what kind of system you really would like to bring to bear in the world?
Yeah. Yeah. When I think of that, now, granted, the title really it plays a couple of roles. So like one, I told you it was lunch and it just clicked and it was something that I really started to rally around. Two, I explored, some existing matriarchies around the world and found both some really beautiful things, but also some cautionary tales. but it also is there to catch your eye a little bit. So I have definitely had a few readers reach out. Actually, I had one very brave soul reach out to me and say, I saw the cover of your book and was like, no way, nearly spit out my coffee. You know, what crazy, feminist literature is this? But I really commended him, one, because he had the courage to reach out to me and tell me this story. But two, he was like, you know what? I decided to put down my coffee, buy the book, and give it a try. And he's like, here I am an hour later, and I realize this book is about so much more. So yeah, to your original question, the matriarchy I envision is this idea of inclusion. It is this idea of chucking Smash the Patriarchy out the window. So I know you shared the cover, I have it here in my lap, but it was very intentional for me to say how to smash the patriarchy and then cross it out and say make the matriarchy instead. Because I want to take the fight out of this. I want to take that moment where my friend smashed her fist on the table and was like, "Oh, smash the patriarchy," right?
Yeah.
Because I think when we come to the table like that, it sets the stage like this is a war. Like there need to be winners and losers. And because matriarchy is so often associated with women in leadership, and patriarchy is so often associated with men in leadership, that it starts to look a lot like a gender war, and it starts to look a lot like angry women versus men with power, and somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. And I just don't think that's gonna get us anywhere. I think it is about us coming together and recognizing our shared struggles, and also the ways that we stand to benefit when we come together and recognize this power of inclusion. And how it's being proven around the world that when more genders, race, ethnicity, you name it, when you build more inclusive rooms where decisions are being made, the decisions get better, and then the quality of life for everyone impacted by those decisions generally gets better. And if that's what I can open people's minds to explore and consider and take home and create change in their own lives, I will consider this, absolutely a great contribution to the future.
Absolutely. You definitely had your book is a contribution because you do talk about some of the progress that's being made, but we definitely have a long way to go. From your book, I learned that the UN Development Program came out with a report in March of 2020, and they had some really interesting findings. One finding that I thought was particularly interesting was there's only 6 countries in the world where a majority of people do not hold a bias against women. That's Australia, Andorra, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, and Sweden. There's only 6 of those countries with that characteristic. And I think it's interesting because while that's true, in this same year, we obviously saw Kamala Harris achieve a great achievement. She became the first female, first Black, first South Asian VP elect in history. So we have a long way to go, but I want to get your thoughts on and your feelings on that leadership win for her.
Yeah. I mean, again, it just points to what a fascinating year last year was on so many fronts. So you're right. March 3rd, that study came out. It said 90% of the world holds at least one bias against women. And so this was around the same time I'm on my writing journey, I'm unpacking this stuff, this study comes out, and I'm like, oh my God, it's here, it's real. And that measured a lot of different biases. So it can be as simple as I don't think women should be CEOs, or, I don't think women should make more money than men. It can be that simple. That's a bias. That's all it takes. So 90% of the world's population holds at least one bias against women. We probably all hold at least one bias against women that we, can start to unpack somewhere. But yeah, so we saw that. And then a little bit later that month, Super Tuesday came and went, and just about all of the women dropped out of the presidential race, which again made you go what the heck?
Right.
We were left with white males as our choices. And it was come on already. But then, of course, we got to later in the year, and Kamala was both selected as a running mate, which was exciting, and then, of course, they were ultimately victorious. And so, actually ended up adding an author's note to the book, and that's where the book starts, because I was 18 days away from turning in the manuscript after
Oh, yeah.
after Biden and Harris actually declared that they had won. And I was like, this puppy's done. Like, I can't go back and be like, just kidding, progress. But it was actually, it was, like I was excited, I was relieved, I was a lot of emotions that day. But I found myself only cautiously excited, where I had some friends who were like banging pots and pans in the backyard and screaming from the rooftops. I was like, this is it. Like, this is an inch in a marathon that is still out there, because yes, it's progress, and it's progress on so many important fronts. Like, optics are really important. So lots of little girls out there can finally see a woman in a leadership position at that level is progress that will have, ripple impacts for decades, which is amazing. But at the same time, I mean, Kamala Harris had a lot of things going for her on that journey. Just because she made it there doesn't mean that everybody still has equal access to make it there, equal opportunity. And especially a lot of women who are of color, like she is, still struggle with many more boundaries and barriers. And we need to wrestle with that. And I think that was a little bit of like old me, new me, pre-book me, post-book me. Pre-book me would have looked at that and gone like, yeah, progress, like,
Right.
cool. Like, here we go on the line graph. We're inching upwards towards equality achieved. And now I can appreciate that, like, yes, it's an inch upwards, but I mean, look, it could be taken away from us so quickly. We could backpedal very quickly. And it's like, yes, progress, but don't forget all the rest of the work that still needs to be done. Don't let this point of progress become the excuse or the invitation to go, all right, cool. Well, I guess we're getting closer to gender equality because now we got a female VP. So back to everyday life as planned.
Yeah. And in the book, you take a very global view as well. So there are obviously parts of the world that have an incredibly long way to go. So it seems that even if key milestones were met in the US, there would still be a lot of work to be done elsewhere internationally for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. I mean, the rates of poverty and things that women around the world still don't have basic access to that are really important. So one thing I found in one of the indicators was cell phone access. So, I mean, it's so ubiquitous here in the US. Just about everybody who wants one can get a cell phone. But we think about access to a cell phone is our access to communication, banking, safety, internet. Like, these are things that make quality of life possible for so many of us. And there are places in the world where there is no access to cell phones, there is no access to internet. So you think about it through that lens, it means, no access to banking, no access to safety and communication. So absolutely, around the world, we are certainly far ahead of many other places. But what I also argue, though, as a world leader in a developed nation, we also have a tremendous responsibility, because the rest of the world looks to us for cues as to what's acceptable. So when we backpedal on women's issues, where maybe we wrestle over, abortion rights or any other things that restrict access by gender, that signals to other world leaders that it's okay to skimp on progress in those countries too, or to backpedal, or that restricting access to things on the basis of gender is still okay. We still don't have an equal rights amendment that codifies in our Constitution that you can't deny people the right to things based on gender. Like, that's huge. That lets other world leaders go, well, the US isn't doing it, so cool. We don't have to either.
But on the flip side, if we're talking about women in leadership here, I mean, that's one of the pieces of the puzzle to this story. We can actually talk about what COVID taught us as it relates to women and how they led the countries around the world. There are female presidents and female prime ministers that actually did a really good job during COVID of navigating the situation. So I think that we can share the other side of this, where there are countries around the world. Like, take the Nordic region, for example. 4 out of those 5 countries have females as their president or their top leader.
Yeah. Yeah. The Nordic region was fascinating and just kept coming up in so many places on this journey. I mean, historically, social policy, they're pretty far ahead, and they come up on many of the global indices as having the smallest gender gaps on a lot of fronts. They also come up on the happiness indices over and over and over again as the top places. So they kept coming up, and I definitely explored their social policy choices that have helped close these gaps and what those mean. But it was really fascinating to see. So 4 out of 5, as you mentioned, leaders in the Nordic region are women. And the one country that is in the Nordic region that doesn't have a female leader is Sweden. And there were plenty of points in time in the numbers game of where COVID was surging and where COVID was under control, that those 4 countries led by women had it under control, and Sweden did not. So, I'm very careful to say in the book that this is not like women nailed it in leadership and men failed miserably.
Right. But it's something to look up to. It's something to look up to as a form of, hey, there's a capability there. I mean, just the same way, if you're a young girl right now, you can look up to the fact that there are now 5 full-time female NBA referees. The first one was Violet Palmer in 1997. And then the NBA went through a long stretch where they didn't have female refs. And ever since 2014, they brought in 5. So these small, as you say, inches in a marathon could eventually compound to where we make a matriarchy.
Yeah. And, I think that nuance, that like looking around for this type of stuff and seeing it, but then also watching for the impact is really important. And what we learned out of the COVID stuff, there are plenty of great leadership stories. I think I made sure to balance in the book. Taiwan also had really amazing numbers in their response to COVID, and they have a male president. So it's not just that, and that's what I really want to come through. And I think that is some people's knee-jerk reaction when I say make the matriarchy. You're like, okay, so you just want women to rule the world, right? Like, go away, stop existing. And I'm like, no, I want us to look at what are the leadership qualities that are making women successful, that are making more inclusive places successful, and that we all lean into those instead of the power systems of patriarchy that we're used to and we often default to when we create systems and structures.
It seems to be about expanding definitions of competence. So I think for a long time there was a prototypical, ideal, disagreeable type A, highly conscientious, which may be a good thing, but the disagreeable type A part, that was maybe a dispensable part of the ideal worker. But that really was the vision for who we want our leaders to be. And I think people like that can thrive in leadership roles, but I think moving forward, it really is about expanding our definitions of competence, both at the level of the highest leadership in the land and at the level of organizations of mid to small companies as well.
Yeah. And it's amazing. I heard you, tuck the ideal worker in there, which is a concept that came up in here too. But just even as you described that, like when we think about our own work experiences, like who likes working for that type A hard driver? Like nobody does.
Yeah.
So, it is about busting up this bias of like, well, but that's the person at the top. So that's what it takes to succeed. And to be clear, something else I mentioned, there are plenty of women who lead that way, who have, modeled their leadership after these patriarchal power over others systems. Again, it's not about men versus women. It's about systems and bias of what we think is the way things have to be, which is power over others, power to get to the top, as opposed to looking at what are the leadership qualities that we enjoy working for. Well, it's usually like empathy and leading with heart and flexibility and humility, and looking at those leadership qualities and redefining what we think, deserves to be at the top, deserves to be in leadership.
So in your mind, how can someone be a true ally? How can it be achieved? And what are some examples that could underpin that for us? And maybe take that one step further. What can couples be doing at home in front of their children or with each other to make sure that we actually have people that are on board with this?
Yeah. I'll share a couple of interesting things because allyship has been a really interesting part of this journey. So there was one instance I'm thinking of. So McKinsey does a women in the workplace study. And I was looking at their 2019 data while I was writing because it comes out at the end of the year. And then shortly after publishing, they released their 2020 data. Their 2020 data asked a question about allyship. It asked a series of questions. And the first question was, do you consider yourself an ally at work? And they were asking in the context of, I think, gender and race, lots of different diversity points. And the majority of respondents said, yes, I absolutely consider myself an ally at work. And then the next series of questions was, okay, tell us what you do. Tell us what activities you do to be an active ally. And like suddenly it was like, I don't do any of those things. So there's a difference in perception between like, saying, yes, I'm an ally, and then actually making active choices to do active allyship. So I think it can look different everywhere, but I'll share it in the context of another story that kind of blew my mind. I was in a women's leadership group with a focus specifically on getting more women on boards and making sure they were board ready. And there was a woman talking about her experience. She had made it onto the board. She was the only woman on that board. She was getting ready to go to her first meeting. And the prep she did for this meeting was to pull down the bio of every single other male on that board, to read a little bit about their bio, and then to make herself a note that to be able to pull from, to be like, Bob, I saw when you published in this thing, and I really thought that was brilliant. She was building herself a toolkit of like ways to be included in the conversation.
Oh, yeah.
If I stroke Bob's ego and be like, I saw this really smart thing you did, and it's related to the opinion I would like to bring to this. She was prepared to like have to do this, to wage this kind of war, let's say, just to be heard in the room.
Right.
And I mean, allyship instead would be Bob reaching out to this woman and saying, hey, I recognize you are the first woman on this board. You're going to be the only woman on this board. And that is tough. Despite our best efforts and best intentions, it's going to be tough. So how do we partner together? What matters to you in this meeting? What do you want to talk about? How can I throw open the doors for you over and over and over and over again? Or taking that opportunity when you are in a meeting and you see, somebody continuing to get cut off, see a woman continuing to get cut off, see a person of color continuing to get cut off, that you go, hold on, I just want to pause here in the conversation, use the power that you have to stop that conversation, to take the onus off of that person who's being left out, having to throw themselves into the conversation and say, I really want to hear what Maria has to say, because we haven't heard from her at all today. Maria, you've got the floor. Go for it. I mean, those are acts of active allyship, and there's plenty of other stuff out there, but checking in with your coworkers, helping to beat down biases when you see them, biases in decision making, lots of options. I think researching though and figuring out what the difference between active allyship and just saying you're an ally is, and choosing the activities that are within your sphere of influence, that right there is a great start on active allyship as well.
And how do you think about active allyship outside of the organizational context? I was just thinking of a lot of people out there that may not have much power within organizations. And as you said, there's still ways of being an ally, even if you're at the bottom of the totem pole. But, it made me think about how much this extends out into the world beyond the walls of your company. So how do you think about active allyship there?
Yeah, that was another thing this journey taught me, is that you can go big, you can go super big with what you choose to do, and you can go super small. So, I mean, active allyship, even just in the context of home, is taking a look at your relationship and your partnerships and your home structures. I'm a mom, so I think a lot about caregiving as what are our structures of caregiving. Active allyship there is looking at like, what are the systems of caregiving that we have built under this roof, and are they fair? Are they equitable? Or are they dragging, one spouse, one partner down more than the other? And if they are, being that active ally to be like, let's sit down and rethink this. Let's sit down and rethink like why I do this job and you do that job. Is that intentional? Or is that because we're bringing in what we learned, what was modeled for us in relationships when we were growing up? just busting it up, just going like, it doesn't have to be this way because my brain was trained to think it's this way.
Like
I
watching,
think,
I was gonna say, like, a husband or the male could be doing dishes, for example, like just even that small change.
absolutely. I think of it, I was thinking of lawn mowing. Like my dad mowed the lawn, my husband mows the lawn. I'm capable, but I just never picked up lawn mowing because it was always modeled for me that was, a quote unquote male job. And we need to bust those up and be active allies for each of our partners. And I think for folks who aren't maybe in partner type settings or caregiving type settings, we can go back to that school setting. You can be an active ally for other parents who maybe aren't being heard, or maybe whose kids you see aren't getting advantages in your school. There's opportunities to be active allyship, to be active allies there in community. Show up for some stuff. Find out, what is your community doing on this front? Who are the people doing the work in the trenches, and how can you support them with them in the lead? I think that's what's really important. So, my background is also in fundraising and philanthropy, and there are starting to be a lot of interesting discussions. Darren Walker out of the Ford Foundation, I'm actually listening to his book, which is called From Generosity to Justice. And it's this idea that, a lot of people of wealth are the ones who are driving philanthropy and can sometimes really drive mission and impact and what parts of our society get invested in. And he wants us to re-envision more of a partnership where it's the people who are having the lived experience every day informing the work, to say like, no, this is not where we need investment. We need investment here in this thing, in this pain point that I experience and my neighbors experience every day. And that it's the philanthropist's job to lean in and go, okay, I believe you, I trust you, and here's the resources to do it. Let's keep talking. As opposed to the philanthropist showing up and going, well, it looks like this is what's going on in the community. So here's X dollars, because I think you should be able to fix this for that. That old model of philanthropy needs to go. And in many ways, I think that is a form of allyship as well.
Absolutely. So actually, in that story, I wanted to ask you, going back to the first story you shared about your daughter's homework assignment, what did you actually tell her at that time? And when you sat down with her, what was her reaction?
Yeah. I don't know. I think so you're the first person to ask me that question. I don't think I ever circled back and talked with her about that one because I was so caught up in reading the Fiverr and raging at my state and the curriculum. But my conversations with my daughter have changed dramatically through the course of writing this book. So I think I missed that opportunity. But, I had a moment when I talk about violence against women, which is still one of the major barriers towards equality. And I had this moment where I realized, like, when my daughter comes to me and goes like, Mom, these boys are like chasing me on the playground and they're tormenting me. And why do they do this? And I go, oh, honey, it's just because sometimes when boys like you, they do that to girls. They'll chase you around and drive you crazy. And I had a real moment where I went, oh my God, I just told my daughter that when somebody likes you, it's okay to torment you. That a form of showing like or love
is aggression.
Is to torment you. Yeah, it's aggression. And I went, oh my gosh, not okay. And I mean, that's when I talk about you can go big and small. Think about like how tiny and granular that is. But I have completely changed the way that I talk with my daughter about like, love, her body, sexuality. Like, I realize it is my job as a parent to inform and empower and speak with truth in those corners, because if I don't, she'll learn it elsewhere. She'll learn aggression is okay when somebody likes you. And that just sets the stage for that being okay, for being what's modeled for us. And I think when we can break those conversations down in our individual homes, that's when maybe we can start to give birth to a new generation who thinks differently and can bust up some of those biases.
And how do you think about kind of threading the needle with kids, where you want to prepare them for a world they may be stepping into, but you don't want to burden them with something that they may not be ready for given their age? Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah. So I offer a few things in the book because there are starting to be organizations that are building age appropriate tools. So I think that that's always one route to go. But, I got really great advice once that was like, let your kids lead a little bit. So I think it's about, when something happens in the world or in their lives, um, creating that space for conversation and letting them ask the questions and follow their curiosity. Um, 9 times out of 10, they will ask like what they want and need to know.
Mm.
And then they will also learn, though, that it's safe to have those conversations with you. It's safe to do these explorations. And then I think as they age and their curiosities come along with them, you'll have the opportunity to continue those conversations. But I do also think there are opportunities to make sure that they're seeing more complete lenses of history. So I will say that's one thing that I have changed. And books are a great way to do that because you can find age appropriate ways to do it. So there was a book I bought on this journey. It's called, I think it's called How Women Won the Right to Vote. And it's a children's book, probably older children's book, but it does talk about like every single one of the women who was significant in that movement. It talks about how that was a movement led by predominantly white women who still wanted Black women to march at the back of the parade. Actually, they didn't want them to march in the parade at all at first.
Wow.
And it wasn't until some really brave Black women, came to these white women leaders and said, we're going to be in this parade. This is our fight too. And they still made them march at the back of the parade. But it's a beautiful book that unpacks history and the characters that I know are not in the history books in school. And tools like that, my daughter loves that book, and it gave her so many moments to be like, wait, that happened? Like, why?
Yeah.
And then we can talk about why, and we can talk about what would you do if you had been them, or what would you do if you find yourself in a similar situation where somebody wants to be in your parade and the group says, no, you're not allowed in my parade, or no, you have to go to the back of the parade because you're the shortest. I mean, you can talk about it in other ways, height bias, like pick your thing.
Right.
You can talk about it in different ways, but it's a great jumping off point, and there's plenty of those resources out there. Although she wants me to write a children's book now, so.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you're going to include this in a children's book, but if we stick on the violence against women piece of the puzzle, a fact that I found pretty fascinating was that at least 200 million women and girls aged between 15 and 49 have undergone female genital mutilation in the countries that have data on this. And so my question of bringing this up is, when you put that in combination with the fact that 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical or sexual intimate partner violence, what role does sex education play in preventing violence against women from happening at all?
Yeah, so it's very different in very different places. Like that's, a lot of I actually in the book do US data and then I do global data because, globally sex and violence against women are still tools of war, still tools of aggression, tools of power that I think in many places, we don't experience it, certainly in the US to those extremes. I'm sure that there are corners of the world, corners of the country where horrible things are happening. But so the global data is really important to look at versus the US data. And I also include a lot of data because that's really what I ask readers to do. Even I didn't know the depth of this data, of how pervasive violence, and this doesn't have to be like hardcore black eye or like got killed. It can be punching, kicking, slapping, verbal aggression, like everyday things. Like those are all still forms of power and violence. And so they have a huge impact, to answer your question. So last year at the same time I was writing, I was also serving as the interim CEO for an organization that served survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And it was a lot of this data that was happening in my orientation that I went like, whoa. And this is a community-based organization. So there was a lot of community-based data there too, where I was like, this is happening in my backyard. Oh my gosh. Like
Crazy.
1 in 3 women will experience some form of domestic or sexual violence in their lifetimes. Period. That's the stat. It's crazy that is the level. And what I found working at Doorways it just has a ripple effect. It can cause homelessness. It can cause you to miss days of work, which then can cause you to lose your job. You know, trauma has such an impact that I think we undervalue on ever being able to feel safe in spaces again. And imagine carrying those bricks around on your shoulder all the time of personal safety. Like when you feel violated or you've been violated, you carry that trauma with you every time you go into a grocery store, every time you go into a new workplace, every time you go into a parking garage that's a little empty. That fear is there.
Or every time you come home.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or walk alone or do all the things. And so violence is a big piece of the puzzle. Like we have to say that any violence, especially gender-based violence, is unacceptable. And it is not the fault of the survivor by any stretch of the imagination. You know, there's been some great memes out there where it's like, we have to, you know, teach girls to dress differently, crossed out. It's like, teach boys to behave differently.
Yeah.
It's flipping that script of power and aggression and what we deem acceptable.
We've touched on a number of tenets. One that we haven't touched on yet is women's health. And with women's health in the book, it's interesting. You're not advocating necessarily for equality. You're actually advocating for something else. What would you actually like to see there and why?
Yeah. So this was the one corner of the book where I was like, all right, I think I got to go there. But I was like, I'm actually advocating that we do need to prioritize women's health. Again, I say very clearly, I don't think that we should just leave men to like wither away while we prioritize women. But I read some really interesting data, which actually some of this global data was updated just this past week on birth rates around the world.
Oh, interesting.
So the data that came out this week was that for the sixth consecutive year, the birth rates in the United States are falling. Last year took a huge hit. We dropped by 4%. And so the concern there is that essentially we are not creating enough humans to eventually be our workforce, to eventually be nurses and doctors and teachers, to serve all the generations that come before them. So it's concerning. And then, you know, the global data, the one that really just smacked me in the face was birth rates are very high in a lot of developing countries. And that's because there isn't access to birth control or great healthcare. And again, procreation, power, forced marriage, all of those things results in some countries having a birth rate of 7 children per woman. Whereas in more developed countries, they're struggling to get to 2 at this point in time. And what that means, as they project that out, is that 2/3 of the world's population is now being born into impoverished or war-torn countries.
Wow.
When you think about that globally, you go, the future of the human race is predominantly being born into poverty. Like, let that sit for a second. How do we feel about that? I don't feel great about that. And that's where I came back to, like, female bodies are the only ones that can carry children. Yes, it takes female and male combined to create that child, but women are the only ones who can carry children for those 9 months of gestation. And so I really do think we need to prioritize their health. When you take all of this global data into account, maternal mortality rates are not improving in the United States. Postpartum research shows, you know, we fail miserably in the United States. There's so much data.
We're one of the few countries in the world with no national mandated paternity or maternity policy. It's a shame. And then on top of that, it's super expensive to give birth here in the United States. And one other thing, it's like a lot more people are just thinking about having one child. And when you think about it like that, it's like you're not even making up for yourself because it takes 2 to create 1, right? So you at least have 2 to make up for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that in my research where it was like, you know, the gold standard is 2 children per couple because then it's 1 to replace each of you. And I just have my one daughter. Like I was one and done because I didn't particularly enjoy pregnancy. And then, yeah, you
Mm.
layer on all of those things where childcare is expensive and, it has an economic impact on women. And I was like, this is good. I'm good. And then, yeah, I found that data point and I was like, well, shoot, I didn't even really do my part.
Yeah, and I think the other great thing about increased care infrastructure is that it's like a very specific policy prescription that people can get behind that has so many benefits, for the birth rate, for the quality of life for young parents, and ultimately for the wage gap. I think a lot of the wage gap is driven by women having to leave the workforce to take care of their kids, or their infants, I should say. So solving that issue of the deficit in care infrastructure we're facing just has so many ripple effects.
Yeah. And while we're there, I mean, this was one of those points where I was like, this is interesting. This is where we all need to work together. So, I was looking at the Nordic regions. Iceland in particular has one of the most narrow gender gaps. And I was like, okay, what's the secret sauce? What's the recipe? And it was back in the 70s that Iceland, had guaranteed paid maternity leave. And they took a look at the outcomes. And what they were realizing was that it was still disadvantaging women. Like, yes, they were getting maternity leave, but that meant that they were prescribed to stay home, that in those early months of setting up routines in the household, they were the ones that were like learning to change the diapers and establish the routines and do all the like housework stuff. And what it meant was that couples were not establishing those routines in a shared way. So in the 70s, they said, oh, wait a minute, hold the phone. This has got to be parental leave. And the country since the 70s has had mandated paid maternity leave and separate mandated paid paternity leave, and then also a pot of leave that either parent can use or any caregiver can use up until the kid is 7, because I think that's the other boat we miss.
Right.
3 months of maternity leave is like just the tip of the iceberg, because guess what? Kids get sick and need things for a long time after that. But that maternity plus paternity plus shared caregiver care, that system, and then that normalization of that system too. Like that's what couples expect. What I read was like, it's almost shameful now if a guy's like, yeah, I'm not going to take my paternity leave, because it's use or lose and it's there. And other guys will go like, are you crazy, man? Like, take your paternity leave. That's what we're all doing. And it levels the playing field. Like, it means there's more shared responsibility, that both couples have the opportunity to set those routines and learn those routines. It also, so say mom still takes the maternity leave for the first 3 months and then dad stays home for another 3 months. It means mom has that chance to get back into the workforce without worrying about leaving baby with a stranger, that home is taken care of. She gets that same advantage that so many dads get when, even if they do take a couple of weeks of paternity leave, they can go back to the office and be like, great, I can focus on work. Everything is being taken care of at home. So yeah, that was a real story where I was like, see, we all stand to benefit. Paternity leave is not just good to be like, okay, dads deserve this now too. Like it has meaning and long-term impact for equality.
Totally.
Absolutely. You mentioned long-term, and I know we're going to wrap up here. So long-term, what do you think is more likely, a tighter gender gap or erosion of some of the hard-won progress that we alluded to throughout this conversation?
Well, I'm going to put it out to the universe and say a more narrow gender gap, because that's, of course, what I would love to see. But we are at a real pivot point, I think, because the pandemic did crack open a lot of these things, laid bare these inequities, especially in caregiving. And on the one hand, I am delighted to see the conversations and the progress happening. I'm delighted that now we know millions of women have dropped out of the workforce in just the last year alone, predominantly because of caregiving responsibilities. And we're going, whoa, caregiving crisis. We need to build better infrastructures of caregiving. I know that there are lots of folks lobbying right now actually to get caregiving included in the infrastructure bills that are going through Congress. So when we think of infrastructure, we think of roads and buildings and trains. And people are now advocating, no, caregiving is infrastructure as well. It's what enables anybody to be able to get into the workforce. It's what enables children to grow up and thrive and have better chances of succeeding as they live their lives. So tremendous opportunity there. But if we ignore those things and we just kind of try and go back to let's just do things the way we've always done them, I think it will be very hard for those millions of women to make up the gains that we had won previous to the pandemic. It will probably take decades for us to win back that ground.
You're right. You're right. So before we ask you one final question, how can people find you, continue to follow what you're doing?
Yeah. So, LinkedIn is sort of where I hang out. So I would love if anybody's listening and wants to connect with me there or provide feedback about the book, Maureen Devine-Ahl, you can find me there. The book is on Amazon. You can search How to Make the Matriarchy. Right now it's there in ebook and print, but I'm currently recording my audiobook, which is exciting. So that should be out later this year. Yeah, some of my close friends are like, I can hear your voice in this book. And I'm really excited to be like, now you can actually hear my voice in this book. But, so that'll be out later this year if audiobook is your jam. And then I'm on Instagram at mdevine-ahl or at Make the Matriarchy. And then my company is Candor Company. I provide coaching and consulting for changemakers. So I believe the people doing the world's hardest work need support and safe spaces to work out some of their challenges. And that's the work that I love to do with global leaders.
Wonderful. I mean, that's awesome. We're definitely going to include that in show notes so people can find you easily. So the one final question we do have for you is, if you could be any animal for a day, what would you be?
Oh my God. My gut is I'd be my dog because she's like living the life.
Yeah.
My dog, wakes up early in the morning, gets fed her breakfast, gets a nice walk, and then she likes to sit out in the front lawn and just like either nap or greet any passersby. So I'd probably like to be her for a day, but I don't know. Maybe I'd like to be one of the president's dogs as well for a day to see maybe just fly on the wall in one of those would be great. But yeah, I think those would be it.
That's a great answer.
My dogs also living the best life ever. Yeah.
I mean, my dog turns 13 next month and I swear she's just gonna like keep going. I'm like, why would you leave this? Like,
right.
You got it made, lady.
Exactly. Well, we appreciate your time. We appreciate your contributions, and thank you for engaging with us in this conversation.
Yeah, this was super fun. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you.
Thanks, Maureen.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.